When we're talking about balance, we're really looking at three separate categories: symmetrical balance, asymmetrical balance, and unbalanced images. What we want to do is decide what type of distribution of items on the page will give us the desired results in keeping with our overall design theme. So in other words, take a look at your elements, take a look at your design concept, and then just decide whether or not an unbalanced, symmetrical, or asymmetrical balance will fit the design. There's really no right or wrong answer. It really just depends on what kind of work, what kind of mood you're going for, and what you're trying to do with your piece. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the different elements you can use to achieve balance, and we'll take a look at several examples. First off, let's just talk about these three terms and what they mean. First off, asymmetry. Asymmetrical balance is perhaps the most common design type used as far as balance is concerned, just because it tends to be dynamic but semi-formal at the same time, and a little bit visually interesting but also fairly conservative. So it tends to be the best of both worlds for most occasions, and it really is the most varied, I think, of the three in terms of possibilities and ways that you can achieve asymmetrical balance. There's quite a few different ways to do that. Let's go ahead and take a look. So here's an example of asymmetry where we're dealing with elements on the page that tend to reflect each other fairly well, but they achieve balance without being repetitive. In other words, we don't have two dots here in the middle. We don't have two lines. We've got a line and a dot, but they're spaced apart from each other in a way, and they're spaced in relationship to the edges of the page in a manner that suggests a sense of balance. All three of these seem asymmetrically balanced. Another example, again, we're dealing with more items on the page this time, but again, we're still achieving that strong sense of balance just through our arrangement of these items on the page. We don't feel that they're crowding any one part of the design, and at the same time, we don't feel they're too conservative and repetitive and boring. Another example of asymmetry, just you don't have to have more than one element on the page to achieve asymmetrical balance. The fact that this line here is not located at the extreme edges of the composition and is not located in the center kind of gives it that asymmetrical feel. In photography terms, we sometimes call this the rule of thirds, basically a position that's just sort of off-center of the frame, and basically something that would be placed at the intersection of the golden rectangle. Now here we have an example of symmetry. We kind of started off in the middle. We started off talking about asymmetry, which is basically a combination of symmetrical balance and symmetrical balance and unbalanced images. This is an example of a very balanced image, very stable, very static. One line in any position, but placed right in the middle of the page. You notice it's no longer here in the sort of dynamic area where it's close to the edge, but not in the middle. Now we're right in the middle for every one of these lines, and we're producing a more conservative approach. This is not a bad approach, and for some design techniques, for some design projects, this is very beneficial. Say, for example, if you're doing a piece for a client that tends to be on the conservative side, perhaps a lawyer, perhaps a business professional of some sort that requires a sense of conservative demeanor of some sort, whatever that may be. Here we have tension or unbalanced images. Now notice just the placement of these items at the far extreme edges of the composition, and you'll notice there's a sense of unease and unrest when we have things sort of at the corners, at the edges, without any real sense of balance. Again, this is not something you should avoid doing. This is just something that tends to produce a bit of an edgy feeling. So something that would be better suited towards perhaps a hard rock musician or something, or extreme sports, of some nature. I mean, something that would benefit from that sort of edginess, cutting edge feel to it that would appeal maybe to a younger crowd. All right, let's look at some examples. We'll start with, well, we could start with asymmetrical balance. Let's start with symmetry. Let me just go and grab an image that would be a good example of symmetry. Here's a good example of symmetry. You'll notice in this image, let's go ahead and bring up our rulers. And what I'll do is just divide the space into equal quadrants, just intersect the design here right across the middle. Now you notice here, each quadrant is very equally mirrored by the other. Notice over here, for example, the information here at the top is reflected here in the information at the bottom. Same weight, same size, even the same font in both top and bottom. Same here with the edges. On the right side here we have a small black font of some sort, very equally spaced, uniform, very rectangular. Same exact shape and space and color and everything over here. The image, the figure here in the middle is split equally 4 ways almost a perfect split. Again, very equally balanced. Even the color choices, you'll notice in terms of value, are very equally balanced. If I were to go ahead and take this image and just reduce it to grayscale, you can see it almost disappears because, with the exception of the black text, almost everything here is extremely similar in terms of value. When you take away the color information, it almost disappears. Just undo that. And anyway, that's a very good example of symmetrical balance. Let's move on. Another example of symmetrical balance here. Again, notice this, if we were to take that rulers up again to sort of divide the space, very equally distributed. Mirror image photograph, quadrants are all equal, everything very centered, text centered, white and black both. Nice symmetrical balance here. Here's another example of symmetry. This one's a little bit different. Instead of using the standard, rectangular composition, we're dealing with much more of a panoramic aspect ratio. But we can still have symmetry, as evidenced by especially this top and bottom image here. The middle would be more asymmetrical balance. It's more of this top two I'm referring to, the pen and the 2 pens, top and bottom, located right in the middle. Notice just the equal spacing around the edges from the center to the edge, very, very symmetrically balanced image. Let's take a look at some examples of asymmetrical balance. We'll talk a little bit about the middle road here, which again I said tends to be the most used, I think, in terms of these three. Notice how when we divide the space this time, now the quadrants, they seem very, very stable, very equally proportioned, but they're not doing it in a way that is static or boring or repetitive. You're doing it by taking different types of objects, different values, different shapes, but you're just doing it in a way that sort of offsets the other side. Not perfectly, but close. Notice, for example, now the text in top and bottom. It's no longer exactly the same. We have a little bit heavier, a little bit more text information at the bottom than at the top, but it's close. And we have no text information over here, but we have an image to compensate. So again, it's a very conservative balance we've achieved here, but at the same time, it's not perfect symmetry. It's asymmetrical, so it has a little bit more vitality. We're getting into a little bit more visual interest here. Another example, again, much more on the conservative side than your typical asymmetrical balanced image. It's almost symmetry, really, but it is asymmetrical because we don't have perfect symmetry. We don't have, we've got 2 logotypes up here and we don't have any down here. We're offsetting it with text. But again, just the way the space is divided, again, very equally proportioned, fairly conservative sense of balance. Now let's take a look at some that push the boundaries a little bit further. Here's a good example. Now in this example, it almost looks as though it's unbalanced because they're crowding the edges so heavily. But I think what you're seeing here is a sense that the bottom and the left edge tend to give us a sense of stability, a sense that the bottom can somehow compensate for the amount of shape, the vast amount of shape we have on the left as opposed to the lack of information on the right. This big negative space tends to be fairly well balanced by the text blocks over here. But you'll notice it's a lot more tension in this one, of course, than the previous asymmetrical balanced image we look at. I would argue that this is still balanced. It's not an example of an unbalanced image, although it is close. I think it's really sort of on the edge there. But when we divide the space, it does feel a little bit lopsided, or quite a bit lopsided, but I still think it's a little bit more balanced. Imagine this same design without this bottom information, without the graph or without the text, and I think you have a perfect example of an unbalanced image. Again, a very symmetrical example. I'll kind of skip over this since we've seen several of these already. Another example of what I'm just mentioning, this one I would say is a lot more conservative, a lot less edgy, but at the same time, it's still very dynamic. It's still very engaging. It's definitely not yours anywhere near symmetry, but it does have a sense of balance. This is a good example of asymmetrical balance. Again, you'll notice that the quadrants tend to mirror each other very well. There tends to be a good sense that these little black logos down here are compensated by this one over here. Again, it's not a perfect symmetry. It's not perfectly even, but it's close. It's sort of like saying, okay, you know, give me a few of these bright red shapes and I'll change it around a little bit and make them a little bit bigger, and yeah, okay. We'll balance it, but we're not going to be so conservative with our approach. It generates more visual interest, and it just keeps things a little bit more vital, a little bit more energetic, but at the same time, it feels very safe somehow. It feels very planned and thought out. Another example of what I would call symmetry. Now here are a couple examples of what we talked about in terms of unbalanced images or less balanced images, I should say. Again, we're talking about designs that crowd the space, they crowd the edges more. You could argue, I think, with this one that it qualifies for asymmetrical balance as well. I'm looking at the top one right now. But you notice here this space really doesn't seem all that compensated by this one, and vice versa. There just tends to be a lot more weight here at the bottom than at the top, and I would just say that most of the information tends to fall in the bottom section of the image, with the exception of the snowboarder up here at the top. Really almost all your key shapes, if you plot them out, 1, 2, 3, 4, we'll count this center image as 1, 5, you know, as opposed to one real clear shape up here at the top with it represented by this rider, you know, that's a pretty unbalanced ratio, and as a result, it tends to be a little bit more edgy in its presentation, but it's well suited towards the topic, which is snowboarding, extreme sports, that kind of thing. Now the bottom image would then again lean more towards asymmetrical balance. It's definitely not much tension here. You've got pretty good balance going on with these photographs here in the middle, but it's not symmetry either. So you'll find that most of the designs you look at, I think, will fall in that realm, once again, of asymmetrical balance. Unbalanced images and perfectly symmetrical images are just not as common. Here's another example of what I would say asymmetrical balance. I've labeled it as tension, but really I would say more asymmetrical balance. I mean, you've got a good compensation here between this logo and the photograph. Again, it is more on the edgy side, but it's still, fairly balanced, fairly equal. Okay, so hopefully this gives you a sense of what we're looking at when it comes to balance. It's really not that difficult to understand, I think, when you sort of break it down to its raw essentials. It's really just a question of how you're laying things out in your space and what's appropriate for your design.